The morning Nora Calloway learned she had 21 days to save everything she owned. She was standing at the water trough behind the cabin, washing her hands in water so cold it had stopped feeling like anything at all. She did not look up when Edgar Stanton finished reading from the document he had brought. She did not look up when his horse shifted its weight behind him, or when one of the two men he had brought as witnesses cleared his throat in the uncomfortable silence that followed. She looked down, not at her hands, not at the water going pink from a split knuckle she hadn't noticed yet. She looked at the ground, at the particular shade of reddish-brown where the trough had been leaking for 3 weeks, at the way the moisture had darkened the soil to a depth she could estimate, without touching it, at the faint impression her boot heel had left in the earth that morning, which had held its shape cleanly, the way dense clay holds a shape. The way good earth holds everything you put into it if you understand what you're asking it to do. Edgar Stanton was still talking. His voice had a quality she had cataloged over 3 years of living adjacent to his land flat. Deliberate, the voice of a man who had learned that authority requires no elevation of tone, only consistency of repetition. He was explaining the livestock security ordinance as if she had not heard it read aloud twice already at the community meeting in September, as if the two men standing behind him were not witnesses so much as an audience there to confirm that Edgar Stanton had been thorough, had been patient, had given the widow Calloway every reasonable opportunity. He said the word reasonable the way men say it when they mean their own convenience. He said the word safety the way men say it when they mean their own interest. He said the word unfortunately with the particular care of someone who has practiced saying it without feeling it. The Harrow Valley had been filling with wolves since August. That part was real, and Nora would not pretend otherwise, even in the privacy of her own thinking. She had heard them 3 weeks running, the pack ranging down from the high timber in a way that meant the elk were already moving lower, and the wolves were following food the way any creature follows food when the mathematics of survival shift. Stanton had lost 4 yearling horses in a single week taken from his north pasture in a sequence of attacks so methodical that even the men who disliked him acknowledged the pack was operating with an intelligence that bordered on coordinated. The county council had convened a special session. The livestock security ordinance had been drafted, debated, and passed in 11 days, which was fast by any standard of governance, except the standard of men who have already decided the answer and are merely constructing the question to fit it. The ordinance required that all livestock within the Harrow Valley Township boundaries be secured within a registered fortified structure before the first hard frost of the season. The structure had to meet minimum specifications, timber-framed, double-walled, with a foundation of treated posts, set no less than 3 feet into ground. The registration fee was $2 payable to the county land office in Glenwood. The deadline for compliance was November 1st. Failure to comply would result in the livestock being classified as a public safety hazard and transferred to the regional stage line operation for the duration of the winter, with the option for the owner to reclaim them in spring upon payment of a boarding fee that Nora had calculated in the 3 weeks since the meeting to be roughly equivalent to what she made in 4 months of hauling freight. She had one question when Stanton finished. Not an objection, not a plea, not the kind of desperate bargaining that would have satisfied something in him. One question delivered without looking up from the ground: does the ordinance specify the materials? There was a pause. She heard the quality of it, the slight adjustment in Stanton's breathing that meant the question had landed somewhere he hadn't expected. Timber frame, he said, as specified. Timber framed, she repeated as if confirming a measurement. Not timber only. Another pause Shorter covered quickly. The specifications are what they are, Mrs. Calloway. I'd suggest you focus your energy on compliance rather than interpretation. He said something after that about the condition of her corral, about how a woman in her situation might consider the winter an opportunity to make a fresh start, somewhere more suitable, somewhere with neighbors who could offer proper assistance. He said it in the tone of a man delivering generosity, but generosity of the specific kind that arrives after the decision has already been made offered, so that later he can say he tried to help. When his horse's hooves had receded down the track and the sound had been absorbed by the distance and the dry October air, Nora looked up. The two witnesses were already gone. The valley stretched around her 3,000 feet of sky, pressing down on grass that had gone to its winter color, a pale gold that looked like something being preserved rather than something dying. Her three horses were at the fence line of the small corral Ben had built in the second year of their claim, leaning their heads over the top rail with the mild curiosity of animals who track human disturbance through vibration and smell, rather than meaning. Hector, the buckskin, gelding 14 hands and reliable as arithmetic. Rosie, the bay mare with the scar on her left shoulder from a wire encounter in the spring of 1876. The young one, not yet 2 years old, who had no name she'd committed to because naming things too early felt like a kind of presumption she'd learned not to make. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she went inside and sat at the table with a piece of paper and did the arithmetic she already knew the answer to. A standard specification timber stable required approximately 2,000 board feet of cured pine delivered and milled. The nearest sawmill was 11 miles northeast, operated by a family named Pratt, who ran a tight credit policy and a longer memory for debt. The hardware alone, the iron strapping the hinges, the fasteners, ran to 400 pounds at minimum, sourced from Thomas Hale's forge in town, or ordered from the supply depot in Glenwood at a price that included a $7 freight surcharge per 100 pounds. A construction crew of 6 men working 14-hour shifts could frame and close a structure of the required specifications in approximately 8 days, assuming no weather delays, and assuming the men could be hired, which assumed she had money to hire them, which she did not. Her total liquid assets amounted to $63, and a credit arrangement with the feed store that was already stretched to the point where she paid it down by $2 each month just to keep the account from being closed. She did not write any of this down. She sat with the paper in front of her and let the numbers arrange themselves in her head the way they always did, without sentiment, the way her father had taught her to approach a problem. Start with what you know, eliminate what is impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, is where you begin. Her father's name was Owen Vance, and he had spent the better part of 20 years underground. He had come west from Ohio when Nora was 4, following the copper rush into the upper peninsula of Michigan, the way men followed every rush, with the particular combination of calculation and desperation that produces either fortune or a very specific kind of exhaustion. He had not found fortune. He had found something he valued more, which was a thorough education in the behavior of the earth when you ask it to hold weight. He worked the copper mines of the Keweenaw Peninsula through the 1850s, first as a laborer, swinging a hammer on the rock face, then as a timberman responsible for the structural integrity of shafts that ran 200 feet below the surface. Then, after an accident in 1856 that left him with a partial deafness in his left ear and a significantly elevated estimation in the minds of his supervisors as a shift foreman who understood load distribution the way a musician understands timing, not as a set of rules, but as an internalized language. Nora was 12 years old the first time he took her to the surface operations yard and showed her what he meant by the word pressure. He built a model in the dirt using damp sand, 2 boards, and a candle stub. He packed the sand into a rectangular mound, smoothed it with his palm, and pressed the boards into either side to create the cross-section of a tunnel. Then he held the candle at the entrance. The flame bent, immediately pulled by a current of air she had not felt on her skin. "Where does it point?" he asked. "Toward the opening," she said. "Toward the low pressure," he corrected. "The opening creates a drop in pressure. The air wants to fill it. The air always wants to move from where there's more to where there's less. That's not opinion, that's physics, and physics doesn't care what you want or what the foreman says or what the county council passed last session. You can build a shaft 1,000 feet down, and that principle will hold. What you can do, what a good engineer does, is learn how to lead it. You don't fight the air, you give it a road." He lost the hearing in his left ear entirely the following year, during a secondary collapse in a shaft he had flagged as structurally marginal 3 weeks before the accident, a flag that had been overridden by a superintendent interested in production timelines rather than geology. He did not lose his position over it. If anything, the accident and his prior written objection to the shaft conditions gave him a credibility that was harder to argue with than mere expertise. But he grew quieter after that, more deliberate, with the focused calm of a man who has learned that being right in advance offers no real protection, and that the only useful thing you can do with that knowledge is to be right more loudly the next time. He was dead by the time Ben Calloway brought Nora to Colorado. A lung condition the doctor in Houghton called it the occupational arithmetic of 20 years breathing rock dust in enclosed spaces, which was a precise and unsentimental way of saying the mine had taken what it wanted from Owen Vance and left the remainder for his daughter to carry. Nora had been 23 when she buried him, and she had stood at the graveside in the flat gray light of a Michigan November, thinking not about grief, which would come later and in private, but about the specific set of things her father had given her that could not be put in a box and could not be taken by a lung condition. The knowledge that the earth has a temperature it prefers and holds regardless of what happens on the surface. The knowledge that air is not still, it is always moving, always seeking equilibrium. And the question is never whether to work with that fact, but only how. The knowledge that the most stable structures in the world are not the ones that resist the forces around them, but the ones that have learned to become part of those forces, that transfer load rather than absorb it, that stand not by opposition but by integration. Ben Calloway had been a different kind of man, not less or different. He had understood the surface of the world with a confidence that Nora sometimes envied, the way he read weather, the way he managed animals, the way he built the cabin on its slight rise of compacted clay and limestone, with an instinctive correctness about drainage that she had come to appreciate only after he was gone. He had built for the visible. The cabin sat above the waterline because Ben understood what water does to a foundation. The corral was on level ground because Ben understood what a horse's posture tells you about terrain comfort. He was a man of practical surfaces, and the claim they had filed in 1873 reflected his strengths: good pasture, clean water, access, a south-facing slope that absorbed heat through October and kept the ground workable 2 weeks longer than the valley average. He had not understood what was underneath. She did not mean this as a criticism. Ben Calloway had died of pneumonia in February of 1875, 6 weeks after a winter crossing that should have taken 3 days and had taken 9. He had been 34 years old. He had built her a solid house, a functional claim, and 3 good horses, and he had done it with a cheerful pragmatism that she had loved without ever fully sharing, the way you can love someone's particular relationship to the world without needing to adopt it as your own. She had spent 3 years on this land since then, and she had come to understand it the way her father had understood his mines, not as a surface to be managed, but as a volume to be known. She sat at the table with the blank piece of paper for another hour after the arithmetic confirmed what she already understood. Then she got up, put on her coat, and went outside to the corral. She stood with her hand on Hector's neck for a long moment, feeling the warmth of him through her palm, the solid animal fact of him. Then she knelt on the ground beside the fence post and pressed her fingers into the soil, clay dense and consistent, reddish-brown where the surface moisture touched it, darkening 3 inches down to the color of dry blood, then transitioning at approximately 8 inches to the heavier gray-blue of subsoil clay, compacted and cold and stable, in the way things are stable when they have been undisturbed for long enough. She pressed harder, feeling the resistance. No give, no shift. The kind of earth her father would have called good holding ground, high clay content, low porosity, resistant to frost penetration, to a significant depth, capable of supporting load from above without compressing, capable of holding its shape when carved. She pressed her fingers in a second time, then a third, testing consistency across a 2-foot span. Uniform. The geological shelf that the cabin sat on extended as far as she could tell, from 3 years of observation and 3 separate episodes of digging for various purposes across the entire footprint of her property and somewhat beyond. 8 feet of dense clay over limestone bedrock. No significant water table within that depth. The water that fed her well came from a different source entirely, a fracture in the bedrock to the north that she had identified in her first spring here when she noticed the pattern of the surface vegetation. She stood up, looked at the cabin, looked at the ground between the cabin and the corral, looked at the sky, which had the pale, exhausted quality of late October sky in Colorado, the blue of a thing that is running out. She went back inside and found the piece of paper. On the back of it, the side she had not yet written on, she began to draw. Not the elevation view of a building, not the kind of drawing Ben would have made with its upward lines and its angles against the sky. She drew a cross-section. She drew what was below her feet. The cabin's footprint was 24 feet by 18 feet, sitting on a dry stacked stone perimeter about 18 inches wide and 2 feet deep. Below that, the clay began. She sketched the clay layer with short horizontal lines the way her father had sketched shaft cross-sections in the margins of his shift reports. She marked the depth to bedrock. She marked the approximate water table. She drew the things she needed: 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, 7 feet of clear height. The numbers came without having to think hard about them, because she had already been thinking about them in the way she thought about most things, not as a deliberate exercise, but as a constant background process, the way a person who has spent years watching structural behavior learns to read a situation before they are consciously aware of reading it. She needed to move approximately 1,700 cubic feet of earth. She stared at that figure for a long time. It was not an impossible number in the abstract. In the abstract, it was just dirt. But 1,700 cubic feet of dense clay weighs approximately 60 tons, and 60 tons of material moved by a single woman with a shovel and a modified wheelbarrow in 21 days while maintaining the appearance of a household going about its normal businesses was not the abstract. It was a margin of error so thin it left no room for illness, for broken equipment, for rain that turned the excavated walls to mud for anything. She did the calculation a second time slower. 14 working hours per day, 21 days, 294 hours total. A wheelbarrow of dense clay weighs roughly 150 pounds when loaded correctly. Each cycle dig load moved to the creek bed behind the property dump return takes approximately 20 minutes, accounting for the distance and the concealment protocol she was already designing in the back of her mind. The protocol that involved timing the disposal runs for the afternoon fog that settled in the creek hollow between 2 and 5 o'clock, the same fog that made the back of her property invisible from the road. 1,700 cubic feet at 150 pounds per load, converted and calculated, meant she needed approximately 840 wheelbarrow runs. 840 runs at 20 minutes each was 280 hours of transport alone, not counting the actual excavation, not counting the structural work, not counting the ventilation system she was already designing, because the ventilation system was the whole point. The ventilation system was the difference between a hole in the ground and a functional shelter, and without it, the horses would either overheat or asphyxiate within 4 days, and none of this would matter. She put the pencil down, looked at the numbers. 14 hours remained after subtracting the transport from the total available time. 14 hours for excavation, structural reinforcement, the ventilation network, the access ramp, and the ceiling of the floor above. 14 hours. She thought about that for a moment, and the thought was not comfortable, but it was also not paralyzing, because discomfort without paralysis was something she had been practicing for 3 years, and she had gotten reasonably good at it. She picked the pencil back up and made a note in the margin of the drawing: start from below, not above. That note mattered more than the calculations. The calculations told her it was barely possible. The note told her how. If she began excavating from inside the cabin, if she lifted the floor planks in the center of the main room and started dropping the material directly into buckets that she could haul out through the trap door she would build into the far corner, She avoided the most dangerous single variable being seen. A woman carrying dirt in a wheelbarrow from her front yard to a creek bed is a woman building something. A woman who appears to be sweeping her floors and occasionally carrying small loads of what looks like garden amendment to the creek bank is a woman tidying up before she admits defeat. The difference between those two images was the difference between 21 days and 0. She was on her third cup of coffee when she noticed she had not eaten since early morning. She made a meal, ate it, standing at the stove, and thought about the specific problem of the ventilation system, which was not incidental to the design, but central to it, the element on which everything else depended, the reason a hole in the ground would work where a timber barn would fail. Her father had explained the thermal dynamics of deep earth to her when she was 16, the winter she visited him at the mine operations for the last time before he became too ill for her to make the trip without worrying about leaving him. He had taken her down into one of the shallower access shafts, not far 40 feet below the surface, and asked her what she noticed. She had noticed the warmth, not the dramatic heat of deep underground work, but a steady, consistent temperature that was entirely disconnected from the December air above. 55 degrees, he said. Give or take a few degrees, depending on local geology, that's what you find at depth. Summer, winter, blizzard, heat wave. Doesn't matter. The earth below the frost line holds a temperature, and it does not deviate. It's not the earth generating heat the way a furnace does. It's the earth maintaining equilibrium the way a very large thermal mass does. Mass that big doesn't respond to short-term fluctuations. It responds to the average of centuries. He had looked at her with the expression she associated with the moments he thought he was teaching her something she might actually use, careful, almost solemn. That's your insulation, he said. That's your heating system. You don't need to build it. You just need to find it. The challenge was not keeping the horses warm. The earth would manage that. A space 8 feet below the surface properly enclosed would maintain a temperature that made winter survival not just possible, but comfortable. The challenge was managing what came with warm animals in an enclosed space: breath, moisture, and most critically, scent. 3 horses produce a continuous output of biological material, exhaled air manure body oils, the particular warm musk of horse coat, and in a standard structure, all of that rises through whatever ventilation exists and disperses into the air above. Wolves track that dispersed scent at distances that make any surface shelter within a mile of wolf territory essentially a beacon. A timber barn was not protection from a determined wolf pack. It was a location marker with a latching door. What she needed was a system that did not disperse the scent upward. What she needed was a system that captured it and destroyed it before it reached the surface. She thought about this for a long time, and the solution, when it arrived, came in the specific way solutions arrived for her, not as a sudden idea, but as the recognition of a pattern she had already seen somewhere else. She had seen her father redirect airflow in shaft designs that required smoke removal without draft reversal. She had watched him trace the path of a chimney's draw across a cross-section diagram, explaining how the negative pressure created by a rising column of heated air above a fire could be used to pull air from adjacent spaces if those spaces were connected at the right points. The fire does not pull air in because it needs air. It pulls air in because it creates a low-pressure zone that surrounding higher-pressure air rushes to fill. And if you build a connected passage that takes advantage of that differential, you can move air from wherever you want to the fire, and whatever that air carries will go with it. She drew the system on the paper below her cross-section sketch. An intake pipestone, dry-laid, buried 3 feet down, running 50 feet from the north brush line to the underground space, would deliver air that had been pre-warmed by its passage through the Earth's constant temperature zone before it reached the horses. The exhaust was the critical part. Instead of venting upward through a separate opening, which would carry scent directly into the air, the exhaust would run horizontally underground and connect to the back of the existing chimney flue. The heat of the cooking fire would create negative pressure in the flue, pulling air from the underground space through the exhaust passage. The air would carry the horse's scent through the fire. The fire would combust the organic compounds in that air, or at minimum, it would mask them completely in the overwhelming aromatic signature of burning oak and pine. A wolf's nose searching for horse scent on the air would find wood smoke, nothing more. The physics were not complicated. They were simply the application of principles that existed whether or not anyone thought to use them. That was the thing about physics that she had always found consoling. It did not care about her situation. It did not offer sympathy or difficulty. It offered rules, and the rules applied equally to everyone, regardless of whether they had the money to hire a crew or the social standing to command a county council's attention. What she was proposing was not novel. It was not magic. It was not even particularly clever in the grand scheme of engineering knowledge. It was the application of things that were true to a problem that had been assumed to have only one solution. Edgar Stanton believed that safety was something built upward, something visible, something registered and certified and approved by the men who wrote the specifications. He was not wrong that a timber barn could protect livestock. He was wrong that it was the only thing that could. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay on her back and listened to the wind moving around the corners of the cabin, with the particular tone it used in late October, a lower register than the summer wind, more sustained, as if it had begun to mean business. She thought about the hinge points of the plan, the moisture issue, which she had identified as a significant risk, because dense clay at depth often contains embedded water that can saturate the floor of an excavation and compromise the load-bearing capacity of the walls. The ramp angle, which had to accommodate a frightened young horse as well as confident adult ones. The floor ceiling, which had to be complete enough to pass visual inspection from above and yet operable by a single person with minimal noise. She thought about her father, not with grief. Grief had its own time, and she had learned not to mix it with work, but with something closer to gratitude. The specific gratitude of a person who has been given without ceremony or explicit intention exactly the set of knowledge they turn out to need. Owen Vance had not been preparing her for Edgar Stanton's ordinance. He had been teaching her to read the earth because the earth was what he knew, and passing on what you know is what you do for the people you love, even when neither of you understands yet what they'll need it for. She was on the property before dawn. She spent the first day not digging, not moving a single plank, but walking. She paced the interior of the cabin, marking the floor with chalk lines. She walked the perimeter of the property, observing drainage patterns in the soil, pressing her boot heel into specific spots and noting the resistance. She walked the creek bed that ran behind the eastern fence line, calculating how much excavated material could be deposited there over 21 days, without creating an obvious accumulation visible from the road or from Stanton's line riders, who she had counted 3 times in the past week coming along the north track. The answer was all of it if she mixed the deposits with creek gravel and leaf material and spaced them across 3 separate sites rather than one. She made a note of the sites. She identified the fog window, the specific afternoon hours when the creek hollow filled with ground fog that reduced visibility from the road to near zero. She would work the disposal runs inside that window every day, no exceptions. On the second day, she walked the area again and found something she had not expected: a shallow depression in the northwest corner of her property, approximately 6 feet across and 8 inches deep, filled now with dead grass, but with a subsurface profile that was distinctly different from the surrounding soil. She probed it with a length of iron rod. The resistance changed at 18 inches, softer, looser, different in character from the surrounding clay. Someone had dug here before. Not recently. The disturbed layer had been compacted by years of surface pressure to a consistency harder than virgin clay above, but different in structure, the way a healed wound is different from unbroken skin. She stood at the edge of this depression for a long time, trying to understand who had dug here and when and why they had stopped. The homestead records at the county office showed no prior claim on this specific parcel. But that meant nothing for the decades before the registration system had been functional. Miners, trappers, people passing through people who had started something and then found a reason not to continue. She did not know who had started it. She noted that the pre-compacted soil would offer slightly less resistance to her shovel in that area and slightly better drainage from the embedded water migration paths that disturbance creates over time. Whoever had started it had given her a small advantage without knowing they would. She moved on. On the third morning, the morning of October 13th, she lifted the first floor plank. It was a board she had been planning to replace anyway, pine that had gone gray and slightly soft at the edges from 3 winters of temperature cycling, and its removal created an opening roughly 14 inches wide and 5 feet long in the center of the main room. She took the board outside and leaned it against the wood stack in a way that looked intentional, the kind of maintenance project anyone might undertake. Then she went back inside, knelt at the edge of the opening, and dropped a small stone into the darkness. She heard it hit, a clean, solid sound, not the hollow sound of a void or the soft sound of saturated soil, a compact, resistant impact, dense clay, exactly as measured, exactly as expected. She sat back on her heels and looked at the hole. The light came through it in a thin column that illuminated a roughly circular patch of subsoil, red-brown and dense, waiting with the complete indifference of Earth to whatever she decided to do with it next. She was about to stand and retrieve her tools from the shed when a movement at the edge of her peripheral vision stopped her. Through the south window, at the distance of perhaps 60 yards along the track, a figure stood with a horse, not moving, not approaching, simply standing with one hand on his horse's neck, looking toward the cabin with the stillness of a man who was trying to determine something before deciding whether to continue. Thomas Hale was the blacksmith and farrier for the Harrow Valley community, a position that gave him a particular form of social centrality in a frontier settlement. Everyone needed him, which meant everyone talked to him, which meant he knew things that people in more socially stratified arrangements would never have told a craftsman. He was 51 years old, gray at the temples, and throughout his beard, with the kind of forearms that come from 30 years at a forge, and the kind of economy of movement that comes from 30 years of managing heavy materials in tight spaces. He had been present at the community meeting in September when the ordinance was read into the record, and he had said nothing which Nora had noted, because Thomas Hale not speaking at a meeting was not the same as Thomas Hale not having an opinion. It was Thomas Hale deciding that his opinion required more information before it was worth the expenditure of saying it out loud. He stood at the track for perhaps 30 seconds. She watched him without moving to the window, watched him through the angle of the glass, the way you watch something when you want to see what it does before it knows it's being seen. Then he remounted his horse, turned and rode back toward town without having approached the property at all. She remained where she was on her heels beside the open floor plank. He had seen something, or he had seen the absence of something. The absence of lumber deliveries, the absence of construction activity, the absence of the visible machinery of compliance. And he had ridden to the edge of her property and stopped and looked and then turned around. She could not know what conclusion he had drawn. She knew only that Thomas Hale was not Edgar Stanton, that his silence at the meeting had been a different kind of silence than Stanton's certainty, and that a man who rides to the edge of a property and turns around without approaching has made a specific choice, which is the choice to wait and see. She turned back to the opening in the floor, retrieved her tools, lowered herself into the beginning of the space that would save 3 horses and 21 days and 3 years of standing her ground on a piece of Colorado earth that belonged to her in the precise legal sense that only becomes visible when someone tries to take it away. She pressed the blade of her shovel into the clay and felt the resistance travel up the handle and into her palms. It was solid. It was workable. It was exactly what she had. She began. The weight of the first shovelful surprised her, and she was glad it did. Surprise meant she had calculated correctly for the first load and not the 10,000th, which was the failure mode of optimistic planning. You plan for the beginning and assume momentum will carry you through the middle. She had seen that failure in mine operations in Ben's approach to the second winter, in the way the county council had passed the ordinance without calculating what compliance would actually require from the people who were not Edgar Stanton. She adjusted her grip, shifted her stance, and developed within 20 minutes the specific rhythm that the work demanded: a hip-driven rotation on the dig, a short controlled swing on the transfer to the bucket, 3 scoops to a half-full bucket, 6 buckets to a loaded wheelbarrow. She counted. She always counted. Counting was not tedious when the count meant something. She worked until the light through the window shifted from white to gold, which was late morning, then climbed out of the opening and replaced the floor plank. She ate a cold meal standing at the counter, the kind of meal that is fuel rather than occasion. She watched the track through the window for 15 minutes, establishing the pattern of traffic, the rhythm of who passed at what time, and how attentively they looked at properties that were not their own. Ruth Adler's husband came through at 10:30 with a load of fence wire. 2 riders she didn't recognize moving south toward the pass came through just after 11. After that, nothing. The afternoon would be hers. She spent the next 3 hours moving material. The wheelbarrow she had modified by reinforcing the handles with wrapped leather at the grip points and lowering the axle position to improve load stability at the wheel. A modification that added 45 minutes of work before she had started, but would save her, she calculated, approximately 3 minutes per load over 800 loads, which summed to 40 hours of recovered time. Engineering, her father had told her, is mostly the management of future inconvenience by investing current effort. She had thought about that line often in the years since his death. She thought about it now as she pushed the modified wheelbarrow along the back fence line toward the first disposal site, keeping her pace unhurried, keeping her posture the posture of domestic maintenance rather than construction labor. She deposited the material at the first site, mixed it with 2 shovelfuls of existing creek gravel and a covering of dead leaves she had pre-gathered and staged the previous evening. She looked at the result. It looked like disturbed creek bank. It looked like nothing. She went back to the cabin. On the 4th day, she found the water. She had been expecting it, or something like it, which was why she had not been surprised when it appeared only by the depth at which it occurred, which was 4 feet, rather than the 5 or 6 she had estimated. A seep, not a spring, a thin lateral migration of moisture through a permeable layer embedded in the clay, moving at a rate that left the lower walls of the excavation damp, rather than wet, but damp consistently, without drying between her working sessions. In a timber structure, this would have been a moderate nuisance, manageable with drainage gravel. In an underground structure, whose walls were also its primary structural material, it was a direct threat to everything. Clay that becomes saturated loses its shear strength. A wall that has lost its shear strength does not announce its failure in advance. It simply fails. She climbed out of the excavation and sat on the cabin floor beside the opening and thought. Her father had managed seeps in mine shafts using tile drains, sections of pipe laid end to end in a gravel bed positioned to intercept the lateral water flow and redirected away from the working area. She did not have purpose-built pipe. She did have in the storage shed behind the cabin 14 feet of hollowed-out pine log segments that Ben had used for a water conveyance project. The first spring never finished, abandoned, when the season shifted before he could complete the installation. The segments were not ideal wood in a moist clay environment, would eventually degrade, but eventually was a long time from now, and now was what she was working with. She spent an hour and a half of her work window that day and all of the following morning's session constructing a drainage system from the pine segments positioned in a gravel bed she assembled from creek material, carried in the same wheelbarrow runs as the excavated clay. The system added approximately 12 inches of floor depth to the excavation on the uphill side where the seep was most active, and redirected the moisture to a point outside the cabin's footprint where she could manage it as a visible surface. Drainage feature a shallow trench along the north wall that she covered with flat stones and presented to anyone who noticed it as a gutter repair she had been meaning to address. The work added a day and a half to her timeline. She recalculated. The margin had gone from thin to almost nothing. She worked an extra 2 hours the following morning before first light, using the lantern with its shutter set to cast a minimum footprint through the windows. It was on the seventh day that Thomas Hale came to the property. She heard the horse before she heard the man, the specific rhythm of a working horse at a walk rather than a traveling pace, the sound of someone approaching without hurry. She had the floor plank in place well before he reached the gate. She was at the stove when he knocked. He was holding a set of leather hinges that she had not ordered and had not needed. He explained that he had been passing by and thought she might be able to use them given that she had mentioned some months ago that the barn gate had a hinge wearing thin. She had mentioned no such thing, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. She noted the leather hinges. She noted the way his eyes moved through the visible space of the cabin without appearing to move the practiced peripheral scanning of a man who sees the structural reality of things as automatically as other people see their surfaces. She noted the way his gaze paused for exactly the duration of a half-breath at the center of the floor, where the plank she had replaced that morning was fractionally higher than its neighbors, the clay still moving beneath it. His voice was entirely level. "I notice you haven't placed a lumber order with the Pratt mill." She met his eyes. "I'm evaluating my options." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite neutral and not quite anything she had a word for. "They run deliveries on Fridays," he said. "If you need me to pass a message, say the word." He set the leather hinges on the table with the careful placement of someone leaving something that can be picked up or left with equal dignity in either choice. Then he walked to the door and put his hand on the frame and said without turning, "The Pratt mill uses green timber for a lot of their framing stock. Doesn't cure right for a mountain winter." He paused. A person who knew what they were building might want to know that. He left before she had decided what to say to that which she recognized as a form of kindness, giving her information and then removing himself before she had to acknowledge receiving it. She stood in the cabin after the sound of his horse had gone and thought about Thomas Hale for a long moment. He was not an ally, not yet. He was a man in a community that ran on consensus who had made the specific choice to not look closely at something he had reason to look at. That was not support, but it was not obstruction either, and in her current circumstances, the distance between those two things was wide enough to work in. She went back to work. The ventilation system took 4 days to rough in, working the underground portion during her morning excavation sessions, and the surface connections during the afternoon window, when the fog made the back of the property private. The intake pipe ran from the north brush line at a depth of 3 feet, using dry stacked limestone in a rough channel form, covered with flat slabs to create an enclosed passage, approximately 8 inches in internal diameter. At depth, the passage delivered air that had been preconditioned by 50 feet of passage through earth, held at its constant temperature, arriving at the underground space warmer than the outside air by 15 to 20 degrees. She confirmed this by holding a damp cloth at the intake end of the partially completed channel and observing the rate of evaporation, which was faster than ambient conditions should have produced, fast enough to be meaningful, fast enough to tell her the principle was working. The exhaust was more complex and took longer, mostly because it required her to work inside the chimney's existing structure without altering its external appearance, a constraint that limited the tools she could use and the modifications she could make. She constructed a series of stone deflectors at the back of the firebox, sized and positioned to create a secondary draw pathway that led down rather than up, connecting through a horizontal passage. She cut through the back wall of the hearth to the underground exhaust channel she had laid during excavation. The geometry was precise. An error of more than 2 degrees in the channel slope would prevent the draw from establishing, and the draw was the engine of the entire system, the fire's rising hot gases creating a low-pressure zone that pulled air through the exhaust channel, bringing with it whatever the horses were exhaling, burning or dispersing it before it reached the atmosphere above the chimney cap. She tested it on the evening of the 14th day with a bundle of damp straw pushed into the exhaust channel opening underground. She lit the cooking fire above. She watched. The smoke from the straw bundle moved. Slowly at first, then with a steady, definite pull, drawn toward the horizontal passage into the chimney system, up through the modified firebox. She stood at the chimney cap outside in the cold dark and put her face close to the rising smoke and breathed in deeply. Oak smoke, pine smoke, the sharp, honest smell of burning organic material. Nothing else. No horse smell, no warm animal musk, nothing that a wolf's nose or any nose would identify as livestock. She went inside and stood by the fire for a long time without doing anything except standing there. The ramp presented its own order of difficulty. The access passage from the concealed entrance, a gap in the north brush line wide enough for a horse, but not obviously so to the underground space had to accommodate an animal that weighed between 800 and 1,200 pounds. That might be frightened, that could not be forced downward without the risk of a fall that would injure or kill it, and generate exactly the kind of noise that would make everything that followed irrelevant. The grade could not exceed approximately 15 degrees, for this reason, steeper than that, and even a confident horse begins to resist its instinct, reading the downward slope as a potential fall. 15 degrees over the required horizontal distance meant she needed a passage of roughly 28 feet, which she could not make straight, because a straight passage would require an opening at the surface that was visible from the track. She spiraled it, a gradual curve that ran south, then west, then down, so that at no point from the surface entrance could a horse see the full depth of the passage, and at no point in the descent did the animal encounter the psychological trigger of looking down into open space. She lined the floor of the passage with compacted sand, over which she laid a 6-inch mat of pine needles collected over 3 evenings from the timber stand at the property's northeast corner. The needles dampened, sound significantly, a horse walking on packed sand covered in pine needles in a curved earthen passage produced approximately the acoustic signature of a person walking on grass. She tested this herself, walking the passage in her boots, stopping to listen. Not silence, but close enough to silence at the distances that mattered. She brought the horses down on the night of October 28th, 3 days before the deadline, choosing a night when the cloud cover was complete and the road was quiet. Hector went first, drawn by a palm of oats held at the level of the passage entrance, and he went with the matter-of-fact willingness of a horse that has decided to trust a person stepping into the passage and moving down the curve without hesitation, his ears tracking the new smells and sounds, but his body following her lead without drama. Rosie followed Hector with a horse's social logic, unwilling to be separated from the animal whose trust she read as information about safety. The young one stopped at the entrance. He had not been given a name. She had been cautious about that, careful about the presumption of naming, and now she stood at the entrance to the passage in the near dark, with an unnamed horse whose eyes had gone warmed and white-edged at the rims, whose breathing had shifted to the shallow, rapid rhythm of a frightened animal whose front hooves were planted in the earth with the weight of a thing that has decided not to move. She could hear the sound of his hooves on the ground, not the normal footfall of a horse at rest, but the quick, deliberate impact of an animal that is on the edge of the only form of protest available to it, which is noise. She did not pull the rope. She did not push from behind. She stood beside him, her shoulder against his neck, and turned her own body so that her back was toward the passage entrance, facing the same direction he would have to turn to refuse entry, making her body a part of the landscape he was refusing rather than a force trying to overcome that refusal. She began to walk slowly, backwards into the passage, the rope slack in her hand, her feet finding the compacted sand without looking, her focus entirely on the horse and the way the pressure of the rope changed as she moved. For 11 minutes, nothing happened. He stood and she moved, and the rope told her everything the way it went taut when he was considering resistance, the way it softened when his attention shifted from fight to curiosity, the way it took on the particular quality of an animal leaning into weight rather than bracing against it. She kept walking. The cold was absolute around her in the passage, and she could feel the transition in air temperature at the 3-foot depth mark, the shift from surface air to earth, conditioned air, and she thought with a part of her mind that was always running background calculations that the horse would feel this too. The subtle warming, the change in the quality of the air, the way the underground space was beginning to make its own argument for entry. He came. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the incremental way that trust moves one step, then another, then a pause, then forward again. She kept the rope slack and kept moving and did not allow herself to register relief until all 4 of his hooves were on the pine-needle floor of the passage and the entrance was behind him. She led him down the curve and into the vaulted space where Hector and Rosie stood in the lantern light. And when the young horse smelled the other 2 horses and felt the warmth of the space and heard the silence that was different from the silence above, he stopped fighting the situation and accepted it. She watched his breathing slow, watched his ears rotate from alarm position to their normal angle, watched him lower his head and breathe in the smell of the hay she had already spread in the corner. She climbed back through the passage alone, sealed the entrance with the brush arrangement she had prepared, went back into the cabin, and used the pulley system to lower the modified floor section back into its closed position. The iron ring flush set was invisible at a step's distance in daylight. She had tested this. She sat down in the chair beside the fire. From below her feet came the slow, rhythmic sound of 3 horses eating. Not loud, muffled by 8 feet of clay and pine board and the mass of the earth itself, but audible. If you knew to listen, audible as a texture. In the silence, the sound of a system doing what it was designed to do. Outside somewhere at the timberline, a wolf called across the cold air of the valley with a sound that carried no information she did not already have. The winter was here, the hunting had begun, and whatever could not be found tonight would be sought tomorrow, with the same patient, systematic attention that survival applies to every available resource. The floor under her hand did not change temperature. The fire burned low. Below her, 3 horses breathed. The morning of October 29th arrived the way consequential mornings sometimes do, without ceremony, without weather drama, with only the particular clarity of cold air that has settled overnight into a stillness so complete it feels deliberate. Nora was underground before first light, working by lantern in the space that was no longer a hole but had become in the way things become themselves through the accumulation of correct decisions, something she could begin to call a structure. The vaulted ceiling was 12 feet across at its widest point, the limestone keystones she had fitted over the past week holding their positions with the cooperative tension of an arch that understood its own geometry. She had not used mortar anywhere in the structural elements. Mortar was a chemical bond that could fail when moisture migrated through it or when temperature cycling expanded and contracted the stones it held together. What she had used was geometry, the principle that a properly shaped arch transfers compression outward and downward, that each stone in a correctly built vault is held in place, not by adhesion, but by the weight of everything above it, pressing it into correct position. The more load you put on a true arch, the more tightly it locks. She had learned this not from a book, but from watching her father examine a failed tunnel support in the Upper Peninsula, tracing the collapse back to a single improperly placed stone that had interrupted the compression path and allowed the arch to fail not at its weakest point, but at its strongest because the strength had nowhere to go. She was checking the east wall's moisture content, pressing her palm flat against the clay and reading the temperature differential the way a doctor reads a pulse when she found the crack. It was in the 3rd limestone course from the apex on the northeast quadrant of the vault, running approximately 4 inches in a direction that told her immediately it was not a structural failure, but a settling crack, the natural response of a newly assembled dry stack arch to the initial redistribution of load as the earth around it adjusted to the void. She had been expecting something like this. What she had not been expecting was its location, which was in a section of the vault that bore more load than the corresponding section on the opposite side, because of an asymmetry in the cabin floor planking above a variance she had accounted for in her original calculations, but had apparently underweighted by a margin that was now visible as 4 inches of pale gray line in the lantern light. She climbed out, retrieved 3 wedge stones she had pre-cut from limestone fragments, and staged in the shed against exactly this kind of eventuality, and spent the next hour and 20 minutes placing them with a care that was almost meditative. Each stone tapped into position with a wooden mallet, each placement assessed by feel before any load was transferred. The final test performed by pressing both palms against the vault surface and applying her own weight, gradually reading the response through her hands, waiting for the infinitesimal shift that would tell her the stone was moving rather than locked. Nothing moved. She climbed down, checked the crack from below. It had not propagated. She gave it another 20 minutes of observation, then filed it in the category of problems that had been correctly addressed and moved on. The floor of the underground space was finished. She had laid it over 3 evenings using a process that her father called blind scrating, leveling a surface by feel and reference points rather than by sight, a technique useful in mine operations where consistent lighting was not available and a level floor was not a luxury, but a question of whether a cart loaded with 800 pounds of copper or stayed on its path or tipped. She had set 4 reference stakes at known heights, strung a line between them, and spread the clean sand she had hauled from the creek bed in loads timed to the afternoon fog window, dragging a smoothing board across it in overlapping passes until the surface met the line consistently at every point she could check. 3 horses standing on an unlevel floor developed stress patterns in their joints over weeks. She was planning for weeks, not days, because if the system failed, it would fail in days, and if it held, it would need to hold until March at minimum. She was back on the surface by 8 in the morning with the floor plank in place, the lantern extinguished, and 3 horses breathing in the even temperature of their vault below, or eating hay she had lowered through a secondary access point she had built into the far corner of the bedroom. A smaller opening, covered by the corner of the rag rug she had moved there with a studied casualness 2 weeks earlier. The hay went down through this opening in tied bundles that morning and evening. The manure came up in sealed canvas bags that she had constructed from salvaged grain sacks, hauled to the creek disposal sites in the same wheelbarrow loads as the remaining excavated material, which was minimal now, the bulk of the volume having been removed in the first 2 weeks. Stanton came on the 15th day without prior indication, and he came alone, which was the detail that registered first and told her the most. When Stanton moved through the valley with an official purpose, he brought witnesses because witnesses were part of the mechanism of authority. They gave his actions the formal quality of institutional process rather than personal will. When he came alone, he came as a man, and a man operating outside the frame of his own institutional role was a different and in some ways more legible creature. He tied his horse at the gatepost and walked to the door with the measured pace of someone who has rehearsed a specific tone and is maintaining it by effort. His coat was the good wool one he wore to council sessions, which meant he had come from or was going to something formal, or he wanted to project the weight of that association without the inconvenience of an actual audience. She opened the door before he knocked because she had been watching him since the moment she registered the sound of his horse on the track. He looked past her into the cabin with the briefly transparent glance of a man searching for information before he's committed to a script. Then he looked at her with the expression he used when he was about to say something he had decided in advance to present as generosity. He said he had been thinking about her situation. He said the winter ahead was going to be difficult for everyone in the valley, not just for those without adequate facilities, and that he had spoken with several members of the council about the possibility of here. He paused with the timing of a man who has practiced the pause of simplifying her situation. He had an interest, he said, in the North Parcel, the land along the creek line and the pasture that bordered his upper grazing ground. He named a price. It was a fair price by any standard applied to the raw land value, which was to say it was an entirely unfair price by the standard of what the land represented, to the person being asked to sell it, which was 3 years of her life and the only operational base she had. She waited until he had finished. The specific quality of the pause she gave him before responding was not dramatic. It was the pause of a woman who has stopped being surprised by the shape of things and is simply noting it. She told him she wasn't interested in selling. She told him this without aggression in the flat register of a person reporting a fact. He heard this and did something she had not fully anticipated. He dropped the generosity frame entirely and looked at her with an expression that was not unkind, but was completely frank. The expression of a man who has decided that one kind of conversation has failed and another must begin. He said, "You can't build what they're requiring in the time they're requiring it. Not alone, not with what you have." He said this without cruelty, the way you say something true that you also happen to need to be true. This winter is going to take what the deadline doesn't. She held the door frame with one hand and looked past him at the valley, at the pale gold grass under the October sky, at the line of the timber, stand on the ridge that marked the northern boundary of everything that had been hers for 3 years. Then she looked back at him. The ordinance requires a structure that protects them from weather and predators. Her voice even carrying the particular quality of someone choosing words not for effect, but for precision. It doesn't require anything above ground. He did not understand what she meant. She could see this. He parsed the sentence for its literal content, and it produced no useful image for him because the frame through which he understood shelter, the frame through which everyone in the valley understood shelter, was vertical. Buildings went up. Safety was overhead. Walls faced weather by standing against it. The sentence she had given him had no referent in his experience, and so he filed it as the kind of thing a person says when they are cornered and refusing to admit it. He said what people say in that situation. He told her to be practical. He told her there was no shame in acknowledging the limits of what a person could do alone. He stepped back from the door with the manner of someone closing a subject rather than a conversation, and he turned toward his horse, and he had gone 3 steps when something made him stop. It was the chimney. She knew it the moment his stride broke. The smoke coming from it was wrong for the hour, too thin for active cooking, too consistent for a fire that had been stoked for warmth in the mid-afternoon and then left. It had the particular character of a fire that is being maintained rather than used, a fire kept at a specific and deliberate temperature rather than allowed to fluctuate according to the natural rhythms of a household. He stood with his back to her and looked at the chimney for the length of 3 long breaths. He did not turn around. He had no vocabulary for what he was looking at, which meant he had no way to pursue the question the observation was generating. After a moment, he walked to his horse, mounted, and rode north without looking back. She went inside. She fed the fire with 2 pieces of oak. Watching the gauge she had constructed, a small stone suspended on a thread near the exhaust intake, to confirm the draw was holding. The stone moved steadily toward the intake. The system was pulling. She stood there until his hoof falls had faded entirely, then went to the bedroom and opened the corner access point and dropped a bundle of hay down to the horses. From below, she heard Hector's deliberate nose breathing as he located the food in the dark. The inspection came on November 1st, which was the deadline, and it came at 10 in the morning, which was earlier than she had expected, which meant either that Thomas Hale was punctual by disposition or that someone had suggested punctuality to him. He brought 2 men from the council, a land recorder named Peters, whose job was to write things down accurately, and a second man, Dellum, who served as a secondary witness to contested inspections. The presence of Dellum told her the inspection had been designated as contested in advance, which told her Stanton had filed a formal objection to whatever outcome the inspection might produce, which told her he was planning to use the process rather than simply waiting for it. She had a fire going. She had the horses fed and settled. She had the floor planks in place, the corner rug positioned, the iron ring invisible to anyone not looking for it. She had done nothing to the visible interior of the cabin that would indicate she had been doing anything other than the ordinary maintenance of a woman preparing for winter, and she had specifically and deliberately done nothing to indicate she was winning anything. because the appearance of winning before the outcome is decided is information given to the wrong people at the wrong time. Thomas Hale came in first. He moved through the room with the systematic attention of a man applying a specific standard, checking the walls, the windows, the hearth, the floor joists where they were visible at the cabin's edge. He went outside and walked the perimeter of the corral, which was empty and had been visibly empty for 3 days, the gate standing open in the way of something not currently in use. He walked the back of the property to the timberline. He came back. He said nothing. Peters was writing in his ledger. Dellum was standing near the door with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has been told what to expect and is waiting for it to arrive. Thomas crossed the cabin floor to the center of the room and stopped. She watched him without appearing to watch him. She was at the stove, a pot of coffee on the heat, performing the quiet domestic tasks that were also entirely real. The cabin needed to be warm. The coffee was for herself, and there was nothing performed about the work of surviving a Colorado November morning. Thomas stood with his boots flat on the floor planking, and she knew the exact moment he felt it, because she had designed the system so that the floor at the center of the room was the most conductive point, the place where the heat rising from the vault below transferred most efficiently into the wood above, and a man standing there in wool-soled boots on a 30-degree morning would feel through the leather and the wool a warmth that had no explanation in anything he could see. He looked down at the floor. He looked at the stove, which was adequate but not prodigious. He looked at the ceiling where he would not find the explanation. He looked at Nora. She held the coffee pot and met his look with the expression of a woman waiting for a question that has not yet been formed into words. He turned to Peters. He said that the property showed no livestock, that the ordinance's livestock requirement was therefore not applicable in its current form, and that the inspection would be recorded as compliant with the condition of no animals on premises. Peters wrote this down. Dellum's arms uncrossed and then crossed again. Thomas looked around the room one more time with the expression of a man filing a very specific observation in a very specific location in his mind where it would be available for later use. He told Peters to note that a follow-up observation was recommended at the 30-day mark. Peters and Dellum left first. Thomas Hale remained standing in the center of the room, looking at Nora for approximately 5 seconds after the sound of the other men's horses had begun receding. The seconds had a texture to them. They were not empty seconds. He said, "Whatever you've done is going to hold or it isn't, and if it isn't, there won't be a second chance at this." He was not asking a question. He was making a statement that existed in the space between warning and acknowledgement. The statement of a man who has chosen not to look at something and wants the person he hasn't looked at to understand the weight of that choice. She said it will hold, not as reassurance, as a structural assessment. He looked at her for one more moment, and then he walked out of the cabin, and she heard his horse move away at a deliberate pace that was neither urgent nor slow. The pace of a man carrying more information than he had arrived with and not certain yet what to do with the additional weight. She sat down on the floor beside the stove and put both hands flat on the boards and breathed. Not from fear had been a presence she'd been managing for 15 days, like a background process, something real that existed in the system, but did not get priority access to the resources she needed for the actual work. What she was breathing through was the specific physiological aftermath of sustained controlled tension, the way a rope held taut for a long time needs a moment when the load eases before it can assess its own condition. She sat there for 4 minutes. She counted them. Then she got up and opened the corner access and lowered the evening hay. The wolves came that night. Not many, 5, maybe 6, the advance element of what would become the full pack within a week as the temperature continued to drop, and the easy prey that remained on the surface became increasingly worth fighting other predators for. She heard them first through the walls, a frequency more felt than heard, the same register that travels through ground before it travels through air, and then she heard them clearly as they entered the corral area and moved through it with the efficiency of animals who are working a site rather than passing through it. She went to the south window and stood back from the glass in the dark of the unlit cabin and watched. Two of them moved through the corral in overlapping arcs, nose down, reading the surface with the systematic attention of something built to extract information from the world at a molecular level. She knew what they were reading, the traces of Hector and Rosie, and the young one, the shed oils, and the compression patterns in the soil from 3 years of hooves pressing, the same paths the ghost scent of everything the horses had left on the surface before she had moved them underground. The wolves were reading a story that was 3 years long, a story that ended as far as the surface evidence could tell, sometime in the last several days, which would make them persistent because persistence in the face of recent evidence is how wolves hunt and how they stay alive. The one that walked closest to the house, a gray animal large with the slight asymmetry of an old injury in its right rear leg, passed within 8 feet of the spot in the corral where Rosie habitually stood. 8 feet of compacted clay limestone pine board, and one woman's correct calculation separated the mare from the predator that was searching for her. The wolf stopped, raised its head, turned it slowly through an arc, nose moving the animal's entire sensory apparatus oriented toward the question of where the scent story continued. The chimney was behind her and above, carrying what the fire had processed through the exhaust system. The intake was 50 feet to the north, drawing cold air in and leaving no warm exhaust point on the downwind side where a predator's nose would find it. The wolf stood in the precise geometry of a system built to produce exactly this result: a predator searching an empty field for animals that were 8 feet below the ground. It stood on finding nothing, and eventually, because nothing is an answer that a predator's logic has to accept, turning and moving on. The wolf turned, moved toward the timber line with the reluctant efficiency of a predator that has not found what it came for and will try somewhere else. The others followed. She stood at the window for a long time after they had gone, not moving, holding the moment in the way you hold a result that took everything you had to produce, not with triumph, because triumph implies the work is done and the work was not done, but with something quieter and more durable, the recognition that the system worked, that the physics her father had explained in a Michigan operations yard had held in a clay vault in Colorado on a November night when 30 degrees of cold were pressing down on the valley, and a wolf with an injury that had healed wrong was trying to find 3 horses that were for all practical purposes invisible. The next morning, she found the first evidence of the temperature differential settling into a stable pattern. She had constructed a simple gauge from a column of water dyed with berry concentrate, sealed in a glass tube she had salvaged from a medicine bottle marked with paper gradations. She lowered it through the corner access and read it by lantern. The underground space was holding at 62 degrees. The surface temperature outside that morning was 18. The differential was 44 degrees, produced by no combustion, no stored fuel, no machinery beyond the Earth's own thermal mass, and the 3 animals whose body heat had begun over 48 hours to supplement and stabilize the passive warmth of the vault itself. She noted the reading in the margin of her original design sketch, which she had kept folded in her coat pocket since the first day. The system was not just surviving, it was reaching equilibrium, which was the state her father had always described as the goal of good engineering. Not a structure that fights its environment, but one that finds a stable relationship with it, a state it wants to return to when disturbed. She had built something that the coal was making more stable, not less. The tighter the temperature differential grew between the underground space and the surface, the more efficiently the Earth's thermal mass maintained the vault against change. It was a feedback loop that ran in the right direction, and feedback loops that run in the right direction do not need to be supervised every moment. They need only to be correctly initiated. She was checking the structural integrity of the ventilation intake surface end, ensuring the entrance remained clear of debris and that the ground frost had not penetrated to a depth that affected the passage's thermal properties when she heard the approach of more than 1 horse from the north track. She did not hurry. She finished what she was doing, put the ground cover back in place over the intake surface markers, and walked to the front of the cabin at her own pace. Stanton was with Thomas Hale. There was a third man she recognized as Dellum, still wearing the expression of someone waiting for a contradiction to reveal itself. Stanton's face had changed from his last visit. The arranged quality of his expression, the managed presentation of a man performing patience and authority, had given way to something flatter and more direct. He had spent 2 days with an inspection result he couldn't use, and a question he couldn't answer, and the particular kind of frustration that comes from a man who has built his understanding of the world on visible, verifiable, categorical things, being presented with an outcome that fits none of those categories. He stood at the edge of the corral and looked at the empty yard and the unchanged cabin with an intensity that was qualitatively different from the assessment he had performed on his first visit. On his first visit, he had been reading the situation. Now he was reading it again because the first reading had produced a result that didn't compute. And the instinct of a man like Stanton, when results don't compute, is not to question his methods, but to look harder with the same methods. He asked where the horses were. He asked it without preamble, without the frame of the ordinance or the council or the official capacity he normally used as scaffolding. Just the question direct, as if the question were the only relevant thing. She said, "They're where the wolves can't reach them." He waited for more. She gave him none. His eyes moved across the corral, the back of the property, the cabin walls, the roof, searching the inventory of possible structures with the efficiency of a man who knew what structures looked like because he had built many of them and had a thorough catalog. He found nothing in his catalog that matched the situation in front of him. He told her hiding them in the canyon wouldn't work, that wolves would find them before dark, and the law would find her by morning. He said this with the authority of a man who has always been right about these things, which was a real authority. He had been right about most practical matters in this valley for 20 years. He said his people had already checked the North Canyon. He had not come to look. He had come because looking had already failed to find anything, and he needed to see that failure from a closer distance. Thomas Hale walked past both of them and stopped at the cabin door. He looked at it for a moment, then at Nora, and then he did something that told her everything about the kind of man he actually was when stripped of the social scaffolding of community roles and council meetings and the performance of neutrality. He went inside without asking permission. She followed him. Stanton came behind her. Dellum stayed at the door. Thomas walked to the center of the room and knelt. He put his bare right hand, the hand of a man who read material properties by touch, the same way she did, flat on the floor. He stayed there for a ultimatum. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the fire doing its work, and if she had trained her hearing to a resolution she hadn't possessed before these weeks, something even fainter beneath that, the slow, deep rhythm of 3 large animals at rest. Thomas lifted his hand from the floor and looked at it, then looked at the floor, then looked at Nora. Stanton was watching Thomas. He saw the expression on the blacksmith's face, and something shifted in him, not understanding yet, but the precursor to understanding, the physiological response that comes before the cognitive one. The response that arrives when you are in the presence of something your mind does not yet have a category for. Thomas put his hand back on the floor and closed his eyes. He left them closed for 3 seconds. When he opened them, he looked up at Stanton with an expression that had in it none of the deference or careful neutrality of the previous 2 days. "Edgar." His voice was low and very level, the voice of a man delivering structural information rather than opinion. "It's underneath us." Stanton looked at the floor. The floor looked back with its complete, innocuous, entirely normal surface. He looked at Nora, and she saw in his face the specific moment when a man who has organized his entire understanding of the world around the principle of visible things confronts the possibility that something he cannot see has been operating beneath his feet, literally in this case, and in every other sense that mattered for the past 3 weeks. She moved to the center of the room. She reached down and found the iron ring that was set flush with the wood that was invisible at anything beyond arm's reach, that she had fitted and sanded and painted to match the surrounding plank grain over 2 evenings of work that had seemed excessive at the time and now seemed like the correct investment of effort. She pulled. The pulley system leather straps over hardwood wheels fitted with the precision that comes from having nothing to spare and no margin for mechanical failure ran without sound. The section of floor rose on its hinges with a low groan that was not the groan of a poorly built thing, but the groan of a well-built thing being asked to perform for the first time under full observation, the sound a structure makes when it moves from static to dynamic loading. The opening was 6 feet by 6 feet. The warm air from below rose into the room with a quality that was almost physical in its contrast to the November temperature, carrying with it the smell of clean hay and horse coat, and the particular combination of earth and warmth that is the smell of life being sustained underground. The lantern below was burning at low output. Its light came up through the opening in a warm column that illuminated the underside of the floor planking, and at its edges, the pale stone of the vault walls. From below, 3 sets of eyes reflected the lantern light, upward, calm liquid, unfrightened. Thomas Hale went down the stairs she had cut into the earthen wall, moving carefully his hand on the stone as he descended. She watched him walk the length of the vault, touching the walls, examining the intake channel, standing beneath the apex of the limestone arch, and looking up at it with the expression of a craftsman in the presence of work done in a different discipline, but with a completely familiar standard of care. He reached the far wall where the exhaust passage connected to the chimney system, and he stood there for a long time without speaking. Stanton had not moved from the edge of the opening. He stood looking down into the vault with his hands at his sides and his coat slightly open where he had not closed it after riding. And the cold that was coming in through the front door that Dellum was still holding ajar moved around him without appearing to touch him, which was the quality of a man too focused on an interior problem to register external sensation. He was looking at the horses he had built an ordinance around, the horses that were supposed to be a legal mechanism, a pressure point, a tool for simplifying a situation that had not simplified the way it was supposed to. The horses that were standing in a vault 8 feet below the ground, dry and warm and entirely indifferent to the livestock security ordinance, to the first hard frost deadline, to the wolves that had passed within 8 feet of them in the night and found nothing. Thomas looked up at Stanton from the floor of the vault. His voice came up through the opening, clearly and without ornamentation. This isn't a pit, a pause long enough to carry weight. She's built a mine for the living. Stanton looked at the floor of the vault for another long moment. He looked at the horses. He looked at the walls. He did not look at Nora. He took one step back from the edge of the opening, then another, and then he walked to the cabin door, opened it, and went through it without a word, and the sound of his horse leaving the property had in it the quality of a departure that was not strategic, not tactical, not the managed retreat of a man who will return with a different approach. It had the quality of a man leaving because the place he is in has stopped making sense to him, and he needs to be somewhere that still does. Thomas climbed back up from the vault and stood in the room with the look of a man who has updated a fundamental assumption. He looked at the pulley system. He looked at the ring. He looked at Nora with the specific respect of one craftsman for another, not admiring exactly, but recognizing which is a rarer and more durable form of acknowledgement. He reached down and pushed the section of floor back into its frame, and the pulley system lowered it into position with the same low groan as before, and the ring settled back into its channel flush with the grain, and the room was a room again. He left without saying anything further about the vault, or about Stanton, or about the ordinance. At the door with his hand on the frame in the position he used when he had said what needed to be said, and was transitioning back into the ordinary business of the day, he said one thing. My father was a quarryman, his voice carrying the particular quality of information offered without preamble. He used to say that the mountain doesn't know it's holding you up. It just keeps doing what it does. You're the one who has to understand that. He stepped through the door. She heard his horse move south toward town at a working pace. She stood in the center of the room with both hands at her sides and the floor warm beneath her feet, and the fire doing its work, and the exhaust system pulling, and the horses below her moving in the slow, purposeful patterns of animals that have found a place they trust. Outside, the temperature dropped steadily through the afternoon. By nightfall, the first real snow of the season was moving in from the northwest. Not yet the storm that was coming, but it's advanced, a thin, serious snow that doesn't accumulate so much as an ounce. The wolves did not come back that night, which meant they were working the easier ground to the south, where livestock that had not been moved underground was still available to their noses and their patience. She checked the underground temperature gauge before bed. 63 degrees, 1 degree warmer than the previous morning, because the bodies of 3 horses in an enclosed space continue to produce heat, and a correctly built vault continues to accumulate and retain it, and the system does not rest. When its designer rests, it simply continues to do what it was designed to do, adjusting and stabilizing and finding the equilibrium it was built to seek. She wrote the number in the margin of the design sketch. Then she went to sleep, and the snow came down outside, and the fire burned at the level the exhaust system required. And 8 feet below the surface, 3 horses breathe in the dark, with the complete trust of animals who have been led somewhere safe by someone who knew the way. The snow that had announced itself on the night of November 1st did not become the storm immediately. It took its time, the way serious things take their time, building its infrastructure quietly, while the valley went about the business of early winter preparation, the chopping and stacking and securing and banking that frontier communities perform, with the focused efficiency of people who understand that the margin between adequate and inadequate is measured in degrees and days, and the difference between a door that seals properly and one that doesn't. Nora used the interval. She used every hour of it. She spent the first week of November conducting what her father would have called a systems audit, a methodical examination of every component of the underground structure, under the assumption that if something was going to fail, she wanted to be the one who found it first. She checked the limestone arch courses daily, running her fingers along every joint and looking for the pale dust that indicated stone movement. She monitored the drainage channel she had built from Ben's salvaged pine segments, watching for the discoloration that would indicate saturation or backflow. She measured the temperature in 3 locations within the vault, near the intake, at the center near the exhaust connection, and tracked the differential between those points because a uniform temperature indicated good air circulation, while a significant differential would tell her the flow had been interrupted somewhere in the passage network. She recorded every reading in the margin of her design sketch with a precision that was not obsessive, but was the natural behavior of someone who knows that the difference between a managed system and a failed one is often the detection of a 3-degree variance before it becomes a 30-degree crisis. The horses had settled into the underground space with an adaptability that surprised her, even though she had calculated for it. Animals that live primarily through smell and sound, rather than sight, adjust to darkness more readily than humans do. And the vault was not entirely dark. The lantern at low output provided enough light to establish spatial reference, and the particular quality of the underground air, which was still inconsistent and carried no predator signature, seemed to communicate to the animals at some level below conscious processing that they were in a safe place. Hector had established a grazing rotation that took him from the hay station to the water supply and back on a schedule so consistent she could have set a clock by it. Rosie spent most of her time near the intake channel, where the slightly moving air from the surface apparently provided a sensory connection to the world above that she found reassuring. The young one she had begun, in the privacy of her own thinking, to call him Colt, a name so plain it was almost not a name, a placeholder that she could surrender without grief if she needed to, had stopped flinching at the sounds that carried through the earth from the surface, and had begun eating with the focused appetite of a young animal in a growth phase, which was the best biological indicator she had of stress levels within the vault. On the 9th of November, she descended into the vault at midday and spent 2 hours in there, not working but simply being present, observing the system from the inside rather than through data points and readings. She sat on the sandy floor near the center of the space with her back against the stone of the east wall, which was warm to the touch in the way a sun-warmed rock is warm not from external heat, but from stored heat, the slow release of energy that the surrounding earth had been accumulating and transferring into the vault space over the 2 weeks since the horses had been brought down. The arch above her head was visible in the lantern light as a sequence of pale limestone shapes, each one held in position by the ones adjacent to it, and by the mass of earth and timber, and a woman's daily life pressing down from above. She had built it without mortar, relying entirely on geometry, and geometry had held. It would continue to hold, not despite the load above it, but because of it, the compression increasing the structural integrity with every inch of snow that accumulated on the ground above. She was thinking about whether the oak she was burning was creating sufficient combustion temperature to fully process the biological compounds in the air being pulled from the vault when she became aware of a sound she had not heard before. It was coming through the east wall at a frequency too low to be described as sound, exactly more a vibration, a pressure change, something the body detected before the ears did. She stood and put her palm against the wall and felt it clearly, a rhythmic, sustained movement in the earth, different from the occasional surface disturbance of a horse or a wagon on the track. This had the character of many sources moving together at some distance, converging. She climbed up through the floor opening and went to the north window. The wolves were not at the edge of the timberline. They were in the timber, visible as movement between the trees. Too many individual movements to count quickly, but enough to understand that what was approaching was the full pack rather than the advanced scouts she had seen on previous nights. She had counted 6 on the first night. What she was watching now was 3 times that number at minimum, moving through the lower timber with a directional coherence that indicated not random hunting behavior, but a coordinated approach to a specific location. Her location. The property had been circled and assessed, in return to which was what wolves did with promising sites. They cataloged them, came back, applied more collective sensory capacity to the problem, until the problem resolved or until something else demanded their attention. She built the fire up to cooking temperature and held it there. The draft increased. She could feel the increased pull through the floor, a subtle difference, the quality of the air in the room shifting slightly, as the exhaust system worked harder to process the larger volume of biological output from 3 horses that had been confined and were by this point in their confinement producing more body heat as their metabolisms had adjusted to the stable underground temperature. The system was not operating at its design baseline. It was operating above it, and the question she had been holding at a careful distance from the center of her, thinking the question of whether the system had sufficient margin to handle sustained demand rather than the theoretical demand she had calculated for, was now a question with a real-world answer forming. She went to the window and watched the wolves enter the corral area. There were 23 that she could count, with the understanding that counting moving animals in low light through glass is not precise. They moved through the space with the systematic efficiency of a search, some working the perimeter, some crossing the center, some pausing at specific points and spending extended time there with their noses at ground level. The one with the healed asymmetry in its right rear leg was among them, and it went directly to the water trough area and spent longer there than the others, reading the surface with the focused attention of an animal that has identified a location of previous significance. Nothing happened. She watched nothing happen with the complete attention of someone who has built a system for the purpose of producing nothing and is now observing the production of exactly that. The wolves found no warm exhaust point. They found no sound that carried through the earth at a frequency their hearing could isolate. They found old scent traces on the surface, traces that were growing colder and fainter with each day that passed, and no new material was added to them. Traces that told the story of horses that had been here and were here, no longer the same story the surface had been telling since October 28th, and a story that, if the system held the surface, would continue to tell through March. The pack worked the property for 40 minutes. Nora stood at the window for all of it without moving, because moving near a window when wolves are working a property is information given to animals whose sensory systems are built to detect the specific movement patterns of prey. She stood with the quality of stillness that she had developed over 3 years of solitary living, not rigid, not forced, but the genuine stillness of a person whose attention is so fully occupied by external observation that the internal processes that produce movement have temporarily quieted. When they left in the direction of the Adler property to the south. She heard 20 minutes later the distant sound of dogs barking in the frantic register. That means wolves are near enough to smell. She did not hear anything after that. She added 2 pieces of wood to the fire and went to bed. The storm arrived on the 14th of November with a drop in barometric pressure so severe and rapid that she felt it as a physical sensation, a change in the quality of the air inside the cabin before she had registered any external evidence. Her father had described this phenomenon the way a deep pressure drop affects the sinuses in the inner ear, a sensitivity that miners develop from years of working in environments where pressure changes had structural consequences. She went to the door and opened it and looked at the northern sky, which had gone from the pale blue of the previous 3 days to a color that had no name in ordinary weather vocabulary, a deep bruised purple gray that occupied the entire northern quadrant and was moving south at a speed that made the high cirrus clouds visible against it appear to be moving backward. She had 2 hours, perhaps 3. She used them. She topped up the hay supply in the vault, lowering 6 tied bundles through the corner access point. She filled the water supply from the indoor cistern she had constructed during the second week of November, using the technique of clay-lined wooden vessel that her father had used for mine operations water storage. A technique simple enough that she had built the cistern in a single evening and had never since had to go to the surface for water in conditions that made surface access dangerous. She checked every structural component she could access, added 2 wedge stones to a section of the vault ceiling that had shown a minor settling response to the previous snowfall, and confirmed that the drainage channel was clear and flowing. She banked the fire at a level that would maintain the exhaust draw through the night without requiring attention, a level she had calibrated over 2 weeks of observation to the specific burn rate of the oak and pine mixture she had staged in the cabin. Then she sat down and waited for the storm. It came with a seriousness that removed all context. Within 4 hours of its arrival, the world outside the cabin windows had been replaced by a white that was not a color but an absence, an erasure of the valley, the timberline, the track, the corral, the distance, leaving only the immediate fact of the cabin and its contents, and the life being sustained 8 feet below its floor. The wind moved the structure in ways that were not alarming from an engineering standpoint, but were relentless from a human one. A sustained pressure against the north and west walls that communicated hour after hour the indifference of weather at its full operational scale to the preferences of anything that happened to be in its way. The floor stayed warm. She checked it every 2 hours through the night, pressing her hand flat against the boards at the center of the room and reading the temperature through her palm, and the temperature held rising fractionally as the external temperature dropped and the differential between inside and outside increased, driving the thermal exchange upward. The system was performing above its design specification, and she understood why she had built it to the conditions she could predict. But the conditions that had arrived were more extreme than her predictions, and the greater the extreme, the more efficiently an Earth thermal system operates, because the driving force, the temperature differential between the stable underground zone and the unstable surface, grows larger as the surface gets colder, which increases the rate of thermal transfer into the vault space. The storm was not challenging her design, it was demonstrating it. On the second day, she heard the first sound from outside that was not wind or snow or the structural commentary of the cabin adjusting to load. A horse, not her horses. The sound from below was continuous and familiar and had its own acoustic signature that she had memorized to the point where deviation from it would register immediately. This was a surface horse, a horse in distress, its footfalls irregular and weighted with the particular heaviness of an animal whose body temperature has dropped below the range where the muscles perform correctly, the joints stiffening, the coordination failing. The sound came from the north track, which meant someone was moving through the storm from the direction of Stanton's range. She did not open the door. She waited because opening a door in blizzard conditions to investigate a sound is the kind of decision that requires more information than a sound alone provides. And she had learned from her father and from 3 Colorado winters that the desire to act on incomplete information is one of the primary mechanisms by which difficult situations become fatal ones. The knocking came 20 minutes later. Not a polite knock, the sound of a fist striking wood with the force of someone whose hands have lost fine motor control. The blunt, desperate percussion of a person who has arrived at a door because the alternative to arriving at a door was not arriving anywhere. She opened it. Edgar Stanton's face was a specific shade of pale that skin goes when blood is retreated to the core and the extremities have been left to manage alone. His beard carried ice in it, crystallized at the ends where his breath had frozen on the way out. Behind him at the gatepost, a single gray gelding stood with its legs slightly splayed and its head hanging in at the angle of an animal that has moved past exhaustion into the physiological territory beyond it, the territory where the body is consuming a last reserves it was keeping for an emergency. Behind the gelding, 2 men she recognized as Stanton's hired hands stood with the posture of men who are still upright through the same combination of will and cold stiffened muscle, nothing more. She stepped back from the door. They came in. The heat of the cabin hit Stanton the way concentrated cold always makes heat feel not as comfort, but as assault, a sudden reversal so complete that the body responds to it with the same physiological alarm it would bring to any abrupt transition. He stopped 2 steps inside the door and looked around the room with the specific searching expression of a man who has arrived with a question more urgent than any social protocol. He was looking for the source. The large stove, the massive coal pile, the industrial heat-producing apparatus, and that was the only explanation available to him for a cabin this warm in these conditions. He found the modest fire. He found the ordinary room. He found Nora standing 6 feet away, watching him with the expression she used when she was waiting for a person to finish processing an incorrect assumption before offering them a correct one. His voice had the rough, reduced quality of a man who has been shouting into wind for hours. My structures failed, not an accusation. A report from the field delivered with the stripped plainness of someone who has moved past the stage where there is any value in framing information. The north barn took the first wind. The east structure held through the first night and collapsed this morning. He stopped. His jaw was working with the involuntary quality of warming tissue finding its way back to motor function. I lost 11 animals in the north barn, 7 more when the east structure went. He stopped again. The number sat in the room. I have 1 horse left that can travel. She said nothing because there was nothing to say to that number that was not either inadequate or unkind. And she had learned years ago that the space after an honest accounting of loss deserves to remain a space rather than be filled immediately with the sounds of someone else's discomfort with silence. Stanton's eyes moved to the floor. She watched him look at it the way he had looked at it on November 1st, and she watched the same sequence of inadequate explanations present themselves and fail in his expression. The floor was warm. The fire was not large enough to account for the warmth. There was no other visible heat source. The cabin was holding 68 degrees in a blizzard that had driven the outside temperature to somewhere below zero, a differential of nearly 70 degrees, and it was holding it without the industrial apparatus that should have been required to produce it. Thomas Hale was at the back of the group. She had not registered him immediately. Her attention had gone to Stanton and to the condition of the men and the horse. But Thomas was there, and he was not in the condition of the others. He had dressed properly for the storm, which meant he had known the storm was serious enough to require full preparation, which meant he had probably advised Stanton to wait it out, and had been overruled by a man who was watching his operation collapse and had needed to do something about it, even when the something was traveling in a blizzard to knock on the door of the woman he had spent 3 weeks trying to dispossess. Thomas walked past Stanton without speaking and knelt at the center of the room. He put his hand on the floor, kept it there. His eyes moved to the faint rhythmic vibration in the boards that was Colt shifting his weight below, and then moved to Nora, and the look he gave her was not the calculating, neutral look of the previous weeks, but something that had more in it, something that had been recalibrated by the information of the past 2 weeks and had arrived at a different position. He stood. He looked at Stanton, who was still standing in the center of the room with the posture of a man whose understanding of how the world works has been structurally compromised, and in the same way his barns have been structurally compromised from the outside by forces he had not adequately accounted for. Thomas's voice was quiet enough that the two hired hands near the door probably could not hear it clearly. "Edgar, the floor, feel it." Stanton looked at him. Then he looked at the floor. He did not kneel. The gesture of kneeling was not available to him in that moment for reasons that had nothing to do with the condition of his knees. But he shifted his weight forward and stood with the deliberate flatness of a man applying conscious attention to the sensation of standing, and she watched him feel it. Watch the information travel up through his boot soles and his calves and reach whatever part of him processed physical evidence, and watched him have no category for it. She moved to the center of the room. She reached down and found the ring and pulled. The floor section rose. The warm air came up, the smell of hay and horse and living things being sustained through the worst. The season had offered Rose with it, and the lantern light from below cast its column upward into the room. And Stanton looked down into the vault with the expression of a man looking at something his entire framework told him could not exist, something that could not exist, and did anyway, something that was going to require him to rebuild the framework from a much lower starting point than he had previously believed he occupied. The three horses were visible below, illuminated in the soft lantern light, their coats dry and their postures the relaxed postures of animals in a stable temperature. Hector was eating. Rosie was near the intake channel. Colt was standing in the center of the space, looking up at the light with the uncomplicated curiosity of a young animal encountering a new stimulus, or ears forward. No tension anywhere in his body. Thomas went down first, and he went with the purposeful movement of a man who has already processed the main fact and is now gathering the technical details that will allow him to explain it to others. He walked the space with the specific attention of a craftsman conducting an assessment, the intake channel, the exhaust connection, the arch courses, the drainage system, the quality of the clay walls, the temperature differential between the floor level and the vault apex. He was building a complete picture, and he was building it carefully because he understood that what he was looking at was not an accident or an improvisation, but a system. And systems have principles, and principles can be transferred. He looked up at Stanton from the floor of the vault with an expression that contained no triumph and no performance. She didn't build a shelter. A pause that was not for effect but for accuracy, the pause of a man finding the right words because the wrong ones would not serve the situation. She built a mine for the living. Stanton was at the edge of the floor opening, looking down. The hired hands were behind him. The room was very quiet except for the wind outside and the fire and the sound of Hector's methodical eating from below. Stanton looked at the horses for a long time. He looked at the walls of the vault, the arch, the lantern. He looked at Nora. She had not moved from her position beside the open floor section. She was not watching him with triumph. Triumph is what you feel when you have beaten someone. And what she had done was not about Stanton, had never been about Stanton. It had been about the horses and the land, and the specific refusal to accept that the only valid response to an impossible situation is to attempt the impossible thing everyone expects you to attempt. She was watching him with the expression she had worn at the water trough on the morning he delivered the ordinance. The expression of a woman reading a situation and finding it exactly as the physics predicted. His voice, when it came, was flat and drained of the institutional authority that normally structured it, the voice of a man who has run out of the energy that performance requires. How long did it take you? 21 days. Even factual without ornament. He absorbed this. The arithmetic of it, what 21 days of this kind of work represented, what it required, what it said about the gap between his assessment of her capacity and her actual capacity, worked through his expression in real time. He looked at the floor opening one more time, then at the window that showed nothing but white, then at Nora. He stepped back from the edge. He did not try to say anything further. She understood this as the most honest thing he had done since arriving on her property the first morning, with his ordnance and his witnesses in his managed tone, the acknowledgement that there was nothing left in his framework adequate to the situation, in the decision not to pretend otherwise. He turned to Thomas and asked with the directness of a man who has had all his indirect approaches removed from him by circumstance, if the blacksmith thought the design could be replicated on other properties. Thomas looked at Nora. She looked at Stanton. The geology has to support it, her voice carrying the measured delivery of someone giving technical guidance rather than granting a concession. Clay base adequate depth before water table sufficient distance from existing structures. Not every property qualifies, but more do than people think if you know what you're reading when you look at the ground. Stanton received this information with the expression of a man recalibrating what the word expertise means, in a context where the expert is not the person he would have predicted. He stayed 2 hours, his hands and the hired men warmed by the fire, and ate from what she had available, which was adequate but not generous, and she provided it without ceremony, because the cold outside made the question of who deserved warmth. Irrelevant warmth was a physical necessity, and she had it to spare, and withholding physical necessity as a form of moral accounting was not something she was interested in, had never been something she was interested in, because her father had raised her to understand that the laws of physics apply equally to everyone. And the only ethical response to possessing an advantage in a survival situation is to use it appropriately. Thomas stayed after Stanton and the hired men left, following them out far enough to help get the gray gelding into the lee of the cabin where it could recover from its condition. When he came back in, he came back with the specific manner of a man who has something to say that he has been assembling for some time and has now decided the assembly is complete enough to speak. He sat in the chair she offered. He looked at the fire for a moment and then at her. I want to understand the ventilation system. Direct without preamble. Not generally the specifics, the intake depth, the chimney connection, the draw mechanics. He paused. I think there are 7 or 8 properties in this valley with the right geology. I think the people on those properties are going to lose animals this winter they can't afford to lose. And if they understand this system before the next storm, some of those animals can be saved. She looked at him for a moment. He met her look without the elaborate neutral performance of the previous weeks, met it with the directness of a man who has decided that his ambiguity about a situation has become a luxury the situation can no longer support. She got up and found the design sketch folded in her coat pocket where it had been since October and spread it on the table between them. And she began to explain. The winter that the Harrow Valley community later called the Long White was not in the end remembered as a disaster. It was remembered as a threshold, the winter before which livestock mortality and mountain conditions was accepted as an unavoidable feature of frontier life, and after which it was treated as an engineering problem with engineering solutions. The reframing took time, as all reframings do, because the people who need to change their minds are also the people whose entire operational identity is built on the previous framework, and the cost of changing your mind is proportional to how much of yourself you have invested in what you currently believe. Edgar Stanton left the Harrow Valley in the spring of 1880, not in ruin, but in the specific kind of diminishment that comes to a man whose authority derived from others believing he understood the situation better than they did, when it has been made clear and undeniable that he did not. He sold the North Grazing parcel, the parcel he had built the ordinance to acquire, to the Adler family, who used the price they paid him to fund the excavation of a sub-stable based on Nora's design, built under Thomas Hale's supervision and Nora's technical consultation. The irony of this transaction was noted by everyone in the valley and mentioned by no one to Stanton directly, which was the particular courtesy that frontier communities extend to men who have lost something more fundamental than money. Thomas Hale spent the remainder of that winter and all of the following spring traveling between the properties that had the correct geology, assessing sites, supervising excavations, carrying the design specifications in a notebook he had filled during 2 evenings at Nora's table. He did not present the design as his own. He described himself to the property owners who asked as a contractor executing a system developed by Nora Calloway of the South Creek claim. And this description, repeated across 7 properties over 8 months, produced the specific kind of reputation that cannot be manufactured or purchased. The reputation of someone whose work speaks so unambiguously for itself that even the people who would have preferred a different outcome are compelled to acknowledge it. By the autumn of 1879, the community that had watched Nora move small loads of earth toward a creek bed and assumed she was preparing to surrender had recalibrated its understanding of what it had been watching. The neighbors who had offered condolences came back with notebooks and measuring tapes. Ruth Adler, who had inquired about purchasing Nora's horses in October, came in February with a question about clay moisture content and stayed 3 hours taking notes. The consultations were not charity. She set a fee for her time, $2 per consultation, $4 for a full site assessment with written specifications, and she was paid without negotiation by every person who came, because the people who came were people who had watched their structures fail in the long white and understood with the clarity of recent experience exactly what the value of a structure that did not fail was worth. The money changed the texture of her life in ways that were not dramatic but were cumulative. She replaced the wheelbarrow with a better one. She bought new tools. She paid down the feed store account entirely and opened a savings arrangement with the bank in Glenwood that gave her, for the first time in 4 years, the sensation of financial ground beneath her feet rather than the constant awareness of its absence. She was not wealthy. She was stable, which in the arithmetic of frontier life was a considerably more durable condition than wealth, because stability compounds and wealth fluctuates. The county land office received a formal submission in the spring of 1882, prepared by Thomas Hale with Nora's technical specifications and supporting materials, proposing the amendment of the Livestock Security Ordinance to include underground integrated structures as a compliant shelter type. The submission was accompanied by a summary of outcomes from the 7 properties that had implemented the Calloway design during the 1878 and 1879 winters, showing a livestock mortality rate in those properties of 4% against the valley-wide rate of 31% in the same period. The ordinance amendment was approved without significant debate, which was the specific efficiency that occurs when data is presented to people who have been personally affected by the absence of what the data describes. A young engineer from Denver came to the Valley in 1883 to study the design for a paper he was preparing for the Colorado School of Mines. He spent 4 days at the property, and Nora spent those 4 days in the kind of technical conversation she had not had since her father was alive. A conversation conducted entirely in the language of load and pressure and thermal differential and material properties. A language she had been speaking in the privacy of her own thinking for 20 years without an interlocutor who could fully receive it. On the last evening, he closed his notebook and looked at her with the expression of someone who has completed an assessment and arrived at a result that was larger than the one he came looking for. He asked whether she had considered writing the design principles in a form that could be formally published, not just the specifications, but the reasoning, the sequence of decisions, the framework that someone with different geology or different constraints could use to derive their own version of what she had built. She thought about this for a long time, not performing in thought, actually thinking the way she thought about structural problems, working through the shape of it from multiple angles before settling on a response. "The principles aren't mine," she said finally. "The application is mine. The principles belong to the earth. Anyone can learn to read them if they're willing to look down instead of up." He asked as a final question whether, when she had started on that October morning in 1878 with a shovel and a plan, in 21 days she had believed she would succeed. The window was dark behind her. Outside, the valley was in the early spring condition she liked best. The snow retreated to the high elevations, and the lower ground beginning its annual negotiation with warmth. She had watched 9 springs from this property. She expected to watch 20 more. "I believed the physics was right." her voice carrying the particular quality of a statement that has been thought about long enough to shed everything that isn't essential. That's a different thing from believing I would succeed. Success is a prediction. Physics is a fact. I don't make predictions if I can work with facts instead. He left the following morning. His paper was published the following year and contained in its appendix a technical summary of the Callaway substable design that was precise enough to be actionable and attributed clearly enough that the attribution became part of the technical record in a way that outlasted the paper itself, the way accurate attributions do when the work they describe is good enough to keep being cited. The vault under the cabin was still intact when the property changed hands for the last time in 1941, when the county road expansion required the cabin's removal. The demolition crew encountered the vault on the third day of work when the floor excavator broke through into the space at a point where the operator had not been warned that a space existed, which was the kind of discovery that stops a work site while everyone comes to look. The foreman called for an engineer who drove up from Denver and spent a morning in the vault before emerging and telling the foreman that the structure had no visible defects and that the limestone arch was generating compressive forces consistent with a newly built structure rather than one that had been in the ground for 63 years. The vault was filled with compacted gravel and paved over, which meant it was not destroyed but preserved, encased in the road that replaced it, the way geological layers encase the evidence of previous conditions, the way all good work eventually goes underground and continues to hold things up from below. The plaque installed at the road's edge in 1943 listed the dimensions of the vault, the year of construction, and a single line of attribution. It did not describe the circumstances of the vault's creation. It did not mention the ordnance or the wolves or the 21 days or Edgar Stanton or the specific and personal quality of the decision that had been made in October of 1878 to look at an impossible situation and find the geometry that made it possible. It listed a name and a date and the numbers because the numbers were what remained, because the numbers were what had always been real, because a woman who had learned from a man who spent his life underground that the most important truths about the world are the ones that can be measured, had built something that confirmed across 63 years of uninterrupted function that she had measured correctly. The road ran over the vault for the next several decades, and nobody driving on it knew what was below them, holding steady in the dark, unchanged from the shape it had been given by a woman who had understood that the difference between what the earth can hold and what people believe it can hold is usually just a question of who is willing to ask correctly.